Arthur dragged his thumb across the rim of his crystal glass. It smelled of stale gin and terrible decisions. 1,000 guineas, Hastings sneered. You marry the Hale spinster. Arthur stared at the sovereign spinning on the green felt. He didn't want a wife. He wanted to win. Rain lashed against the carriage window, muddying the glass and blurring the bleak London streets into smears of gray. Inside, Arthur Pendleton, Duke of Westford, sat perfectly still. His head throbbed. A persistent, rhythmic ache pulsed behind his left eye. A parting gift from 3 bottles of port and a public, humiliating wager. He tasted bile and old tobacco. He swallowed it down. The carriage jerked to a halt in front of a narrow, soot-stained townhouse in Bloomsbury. The neighborhood smelled of wet cobblestones, burning coal, and the distinct, sour tang of boiled cabbage. Arthur stepped out into the freezing drizzle. Mud immediately splashed over the instep of his polished Hessians. He didn't curse. He merely stared at the peeling black paint of the front door. Behind that door lived Beatrice Hale, 28, penniless, famously sharp-tongued, and, according to every lord at White's, the most undesirable woman in England. Arthur lifted the heavy brass knocker. It dropped with a dull, hollow thud. A maid with a flour-smudged apron opened the door, her eyes widening to the size of saucers at the sight of his crest on the carriage and the tailored cut of his dark wool greatcoat. Arthur pushed past her without waiting for an invitation. The parlor was cramped. It smelled heavily of beeswax and damp wool. The furniture was threadbare, patched in places with mismatched upholstery. Sitting at a small, scarred wooden desk was a woman. She didn't gasp. She didn't drop her pen. She simply finished the line she was writing, blotted the ink with deliberate care, and turned in her chair. Beatrice Hale was not hideous, but she made no effort to be beautiful. Her dark hair was scraped back into a severe knot pulling tightly at her scalp. Her dress was a coarse, serviceable brown muslin that looked stiff enough to stand on its own. She had a strong, angular jaw and a nose that had clearly been broken once and set slightly crooked. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was a low rasp. "Dry. Have you lost your way? Mayfair is several miles west." "Miss Hale." Arthur remained standing. He felt too large for the room. His broad shoulders seemed to crowd the low ceiling. "I have come to make a proposal of marriage." Silence stretched between them. A clock ticked loudly on the mantelpiece. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. Beatrice stared at him. Her gaze dropped to his mud-spattered boots, trailed up the damp hem of his coat, and settled flatly on his bloodshot eyes. "You are drunk," she stated. "I was drunk last night. This morning, I am merely hungover." Arthur reached into his coat, producing a thick fold of vellum documents. He tossed them onto the desk. They landed with a heavy slap next to her inkwell. The settlements. They are incredibly generous. You will never want for anything. Your brother's gambling debts, which I know amount to nearly £4,000, will be cleared by nightfall. You will have a townhouse, an estate in Derbyshire, and an allowance that exceeds the annual income of most barons. Beatrice didn't touch the papers. She looked at the expensive vellum, then back at his face. Why? Arthur tightened his jaw. He could lie. He could spin a tale of sudden infatuation. But looking at the severe lines of her face, the ink stains permanently etched into the skin of her index finger, he knew she would see right through it. She lived in a world of hard arithmetic. Romance was a currency she didn't possess. "Does it matter?" he asked, his tone flat. "It matters if I am to share a breakfast table with you for the next 40 years. I require a wife," Arthur said. The lie slipping out easier than the truth. The ton expects it. "I have no interest in a simpering debutante who will cry when I am late for dinner or demand I attend every atrocious poetry reading in the city. You are practical. You are quiet. You need money. I need a duchess who will leave me the hell alone." Beatrice finally reached out and picked up the papers. Her nails were blunt, cut short. She broke the wax seal with her thumb and scanned the first page. Arthur watched her throat swallow. The amount of money written there was staggering. It was freedom. It was a barricade against a world that had ground her down to bone and raw nerve. "When?" she asked. "By special license. Today." A flicker of something, panic perhaps, or just surprise, crossed her eyes, but she blinked it away. Very well. Let me fetch my cloak. There was no joy. There was no hesitation. Just a transaction, coldly executed. 3 hours later, they stood in a freezing, cavernous church in the city of London. The air inside smelled of old dust and cold stone. The vicar rushed through the vows, his breath pluming in the freezing air. Beatrice stood rigidly beside Arthur. She hadn't changed her dress. The coarse brown muslin looked absurdly out of place against Arthur's charcoal tailoring. When he took her hand to slide the heavy gold band onto her finger, her skin was freezing. Her fingers were stiff, the joint slightly swollen from the cold. "I pronounce you man and wife," the vicar mumbled, eager to return to his fire. Arthur dropped her hand immediately. "My carriage is waiting." The ride to his Mayfair townhouse was suffocating. The rain had turned to sleet, rattling against the roof like buckshot. The interior of the carriage was warm, heated by a brass foot warmer, but the silence between them was thick enough to choke on. Arthur sat opposite her, his long legs stretched out, his arms crossed over his chest. He watched her. She was staring out the window, her profile sharp against the gray light. She didn't look like a duchess. She looked like a governess being carted off to a new, miserable post. Arthur felt a sudden, sharp twist in his gut, a mix of guilt and defensive anger. Hastings had laughed when Arthur accepted the wager. "She'll bore you to tears or nag you into an early grave, Pendleton." Hastings had crowed. "It's a life sentence. A punishment for your unbearable arrogance." Arthur gritted his teeth, the muscles in his jaw ticking. He had bought a wife to win a bet. And looking at the rigid, unyielding woman across from him, he began to wonder if Hastings had been right. Perhaps he had just signed his own death warrant. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the velvet squabs, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels hammering the reality of his mistake into his aching skull. The Duke of Westford's townhouse was a monument to wealth and silence. Marble floors echoed beneath their boots. Enormous chandeliers dripped with unlit crystal. The air smelled faintly of lemon oil and old money. Arthur's butler, a man named Linfield, who possessed the emotional range of a grandfather clock, relieved Arthur of his wet coat. Linfield's gaze flicked to Beatrice, registering the damp brown muslin, the severe hair, and the utter lack of a maid or luggage. The butler's expression did not change by a fraction of an inch. "Welcome to Westford House, Your Grace," Linfield intoned. Beatrice looked at the sweeping double staircase. "It is very large," she said. It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation, delivered with the tone of a surveyor assessing a difficult plot of land. "Your rooms are in the east wing," Arthur said, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline of the wager and the hasty wedding was fading, leaving behind a heavy, leaden dread. "Linfield will show you up. Dinner is at 8. He turned and walked toward his study without waiting for her reply. He needed a drink, a real one, not the cheap gin from the night before. When 8 o'clock arrived, Arthur entered the dining room bracing for war. He expected Beatrice to be demanding, to complain about the rushed ceremony, the lack of a proper trousseau, the coldness of his house. He sat at one end of the mahogany table, which was long enough to seat 20. Beatrice sat at the other end. The distance between them was absurd. Footmen served soup in heavy silver bowls. The only sounds in the room were the clinking of spoons against porcelain and the crackle of the fire in the hearth. Beatrice ate mechanically. She didn't gaze in awe at the silk wallpaper. She didn't try to make nervous conversation. She simply consumed the calories required to sustain herself. Arthur found himself leaning forward, squinting down the length of the table. "Is the soup to your liking?" he called out, his voice excessively loud in the quiet room. Beatrice paused, her spoon suspended over the bowl. She looked up. "It is adequate." Arthur scoffed softly. "Adequate." His chef was poached from the French ambassador. "Just adequate?" "It is heavily salted," she replied evenly. "But it is hot. I prefer hot food." She went back to eating. Arthur stared at her. She wasn't intimidated by him. She wasn't intimidated by the house. She simply didn't care. Dinner concluded in agonizing silence. When Beatrice rose to retire, Arthur stood. It was the wedding night. The phrase hung in his mind, heavy and unpleasant. He was a gentleman, theoretically, but he had married her on a drunken dare. He didn't desire her. And yet, the marriage had to be consummated to be ironclad. He couldn't leave a loophole for Hastings or anyone else to challenge the legitimacy of the union and, by extension, the bet. He waited an hour. He drank 2 glasses of brandy, the liquor burning a warm, necessary trail down his throat. Then, he walked down the long, carpeted corridor to the east wing. He didn't knock. He turned the brass handle and pushed the door open. He expected to find her in bed, weeping, or perhaps sitting stiffly in a chair, clutching a blanket to her chin in terror. Instead, he stopped dead in the doorway. Beatrice was standing near the fireplace. She had dismissed the maids. She was attempting to undress herself. The brown muslin dress was unfastened halfway down her back, but the lower hooks were stuck. She was twisting her arms at an awkward, painful angle, her fingers struggling blindly with the stiff metal fastenings. Her hair was down. It wasn't the dull, mousy brown he had assumed. In the firelight, it caught glints of copper and fell in thick, heavy waves past her shoulders. She heard the door click and froze. She looked over her shoulder at him, her face flushed, a sudden, violent slash of red across her pale cheekbones. It was the first time she had looked vulnerable. "The maids," Arthur started, his voice suddenly hoarse. "I am not used to them," she snapped, dropping her arms. She turned her back to him fully. "I don't like strangers picking at my clothes. The hooks are rusted. They catch on the thread." Arthur stood there for a long moment. He should call a servant. He should leave. Instead, he walked toward her. His boots made no sound on the thick Persian rug. "Turn around," he said quietly. Beatrice stiffened. "I can manage." "Turn around, Beatrice." She hesitated, then slowly turned her back to the fire, facing the mirror above the vanity. Arthur stepped behind her. He looked at their reflection in the glass. He was tall, dark, tense. She was rigid, her chin lifted in a posture of sheer defiance. Arthur reached out. His large hands, warm and slightly calloused from riding, brushed against the rough muslin. Underneath, he could feel the heat of her skin radiating through the thin chemise. She drew in a sharp, ragged breath as his knuckles grazed her spine. He worked the stubborn hooks. It required precision. He had undressed many women, but never with this clumsy, agonizing care. The room smelled of lavender soap and the sharp scent of wood smoke. "I know about the wager," she said. Her voice was quiet. It didn't tremble, but it lacked the abrasive edge it had possessed all day. Arthur's hand stopped dead on the last hook. His blood ran cold. He stared at the back of her neck, at the fine, dark hairs resting against her pale skin. "Hastings was boasting about it in the street this morning outside the apothecary," she continued, staring blankly into the mirror, refusing to meet his eyes in the glass. "He said you wagered 1,000 guineas you could survive marrying the Gorgon of Bloomsbury." Arthur couldn't breathe. The shame was sudden, a visceral punch to the gut. It tasted metallic in his mouth. "Beatrice." "Don't," she interrupted. She didn't sound angry. She sounded tired. So deeply, profoundly tired. "Don't insult my intelligence with apologies. I don't care about your bets, Arthur. I cared about my brother going to debtor's prison. I cared about freezing to death this winter because we couldn't afford coal." She turned around, the dress falling slack around her shoulders, held up only by her grip on the front bodice. She looked up at him, her dark eyes clear and piercing. "You bought a prop for your pride," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "and I sold myself for a warm room and a cleared ledger. We are both terrible people, so let us not pretend this is a tragedy. Let us just get it over with." Arthur looked down at her. The cynical, untouchable Duke of Westford felt his chest crack open. She wasn't a punishment. She was a mirror, reflecting his own ugliness back at him. And in that moment, looking at her bare shoulders and defiant jaw, he realized Hastings had been entirely wrong. He didn't pull her into bed. He didn't demand his rights. Instead, Arthur took a step back. "Go to sleep, Beatrice," he said roughly, his voice barely holding together. He turned on his heel and walked out, closing the door softly behind him. The click of the latch echoed in the silence, leaving the heavy, undeniable realization that the game had changed, and he had no idea how to play. Morning arrived with the subtlety of a hammer strike. Sunlight, glaring and uninvited, pierced the gap in the heavy damask curtains of Arthur's bedchamber. He woke with a dry mouth and a heavy chest. The memory of the previous night, Beatrice's bare shoulders, the rusted hooks, the flat, devastating delivery of her knowing about the bet crashed into him before he had even swung his legs out of bed. He found her in the breakfast room. She sat in the exact same chair as the night before, wearing a day dress of slate-gray wool that made her look like a morning governess. She was eating a piece of dry toast. The scraping sound of her knife against the charred bread was impossibly loud. "You did not sleep," Arthur observed. He walked to the sideboard, pouring black coffee from a heavy silver pot. The bitter, roasted smell filled the small space. "I slept perfectly well," Beatrice replied, not looking up. "The mattress is stuffed with feathers. I am used to horsehair." Arthur carried his cup to the table and sat opposite her. He watched her long, deft fingers tear the toast into precise squares. "The invitations will begin arriving today," he said, deciding to abandon pleasantries. "The Ton thrives on scandal. A sudden, unannounced marriage to a woman they consider." He hesitated, searching for a word that wasn't an insult. "A spinster," Beatrice supplied effortlessly. "A gorgon. A desperate charity case. Do not tiptoe around me, Arthur. I know what they call me." "They will expect a public appearance." Arthur took a sip of the scalding coffee. It burned his tongue, grounding him. "We are expected at Lady Carlisle's ball tonight. It is unavoidable." Beatrice finally looked at him. Her eyes were dark, ringed with faint shadows of exhaustion she couldn't entirely hide. "You wish to parade your winning wager." "I wish," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, "to stop them from talking. If we hide, they will say I am ashamed of you. If we appear together and present a united front, the gossip will die of starvation within a fortnight." She studied his face for a long, uncomfortable moment. She was looking for the lie. When she didn't find one, she gave a single, curt nod. "Send a modiste to my rooms. If I am to be marched out for inspection, I refuse to do it in wool." By 8 o'clock that evening, the carriage pulled up to the Carlisle estate. The night air was freezing, biting at Arthur's cheeks as he stepped down to the cobblestones. He reached up, offering his hand. Beatrice stepped into the light of the carriage lamps. Arthur felt his breath hitch, a completely involuntary reaction that irritated him instantly. She wasn't wearing the frothy pastels or suffocating lace that dominated Mayfair. She had commanded the terrified modiste to construct a gown of deep, bruised plum velvet. It possessed no ruffles. It had no bows. The neckline was stark, cutting straight across her collarbones, emphasizing the sharp, unapologetic lines of her jaw and shoulders. Her dark hair was coiled high, anchored by a single, heavy silver comb. She looked severe. She looked dangerous. She placed her hand in his. Her skin was warm this time. The ballroom smelled of crushed gardenias, hot candle wax, and the damp wool of coats left in the foyer. The noise was a deafening roar of violins and chattering voices. As Arthur and Beatrice stepped through the double doors, the roar fractured. It splintered into aggressive, echoing whispers. Heads turned. Fans snapped open to hide malicious mouths. Arthur felt the familiar, arrogant armor slide into place. He straightened his spine, pulling Beatrice's hand through the crook of his arm, pressing her closely to his side. "Keep your chin up," he murmured, staring straight ahead. "My chin is perfectly elevated," she whispered back, her tone dry as bone. "Worry about your own." They navigated the perimeter of the room. Women stared openly at Beatrice's unadorned neck. Men smirked at Arthur, lifting their champagne flutes in mocking salutes. Arthur's jaw ached from clenching it. He wanted to hit someone. He wanted to drag Hastings out into the street and break his nose. Well, well, the conqueror returns. The voice was slurred, thick with claret. Lord Hastings stood in their path, blocking the way to the card room. He wore a garish, mustard-yellow waistcoat that strained against his gut. His eyes, watery and bloodshot, flicked over Beatrice with undisguised contempt. "Hastings," Arthur said. His voice was dangerously quiet, a low growl vibrating in his chest. "Step aside. No need for hostility, Westford. I merely came to offer my congratulations. Hastings leaned in, his breath smelling of sour grapes and bad teeth. Though, I must admit, I expected you to look more exhausted. Managing a wild spinster is surely taxing work. Arthur's right hand formed a fist. He shifted his weight to his back foot, preparing to drop the man right there on the polished mahogany floor. Before he could swing, Beatrice stepped forward. She didn't shrink. She didn't hide behind Arthur. She looked Hastings slowly up and down, her gaze lingering on his strained waistcoat buttons. "Lord Hastings," Beatrice said, her raspy voice carrying perfectly over the dying violins. "I recognize you. My brother mentioned you often. You are the gentleman who lost his entire carriage to a blind bookmaker in Cheapside last Tuesday, are you not?" A sharp, collective gasp rippled through the nearby listeners. Hastings's face flushed a violent, mottled purple. "You? That is a foul rumor." "Is it?" Beatrice tilted her head, her expression one of polite, detached curiosity. "My apologies. I must have confused you with the Lord Hastings, who was recently rejected by the Duke of Rutland's youngest daughter because he smells entirely of pickled onions." Someone behind them snorted a laugh. Hastings opened his mouth, sputtered, and found absolutely nothing to say. He looked at Arthur, seeking masculine solidarity, but Arthur was staring at Beatrice. "If you will excuse us," Beatrice continued, her tone dismissive, "my husband requires a drink. And you require a tailor." She pulled Arthur past the sputtering lord. The crowd parted for them, the whispers shifting from mockery to stunned disbelief. Arthur let her lead him toward the shadowed alcove near the terrace doors. Once they were out of the direct glare of the chandeliers, Beatrice dropped his arm. Her chest was heaving slightly beneath the heavy plum velvet. Her hands were trembling. Arthur looked down at her. The urge to laugh, a real, raw, tearing laugh, scraped up his throat. He swallowed it down, leaving only a burning intensity in his chest. "You are terrifying." "I am surviving," Beatrice snapped, looking away toward the terrace. "There is a difference." Midnight cast long, distorted shadows across the Persian rugs of Westford House. The carriage ride home had been a suffocating vacuum of silence. Not the cold, dead silence of their wedding day, but something electric and heavy, something that tasted like ozone right before a lightning strike. Arthur didn't go to his bedchamber. He walked straight into the library, shedding his coat and tossing it carelessly over a leather wingback chair. The room smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and lemon polish. The fire in the hearth had died down to glowing orange embers. He didn't bother calling for Linfield to stoke it. He walked to the drinks cabinet, grabbed a crystal decanter of scotch, and poured a generous measure. The amber liquid splashed over his knuckles. He didn't care. He downed half the glass in one swallow, letting the burn sear away the lingering scent of gardenias and Hastings's sour breath. He had expected her to be a burden, a quiet, resentful ghost haunting the edges of his life. He hadn't expected a woman who could gut a peer of the realm with 3 sentences and a flat stare. A floorboard creaked. Arthur turned. Beatrice stood in the doorway. She had removed the velvet gown. She was back in the plain white cotton chemise, a faded tartan shawl wrapped tightly over her shoulders. Her hair fell down her back in a chaotic, tangled mass of dark copper. She looked smaller without the armor of the plum velvet, but the defiant set of her jaw remained. "I cannot sleep," she said. Her voice was slightly hoarse. "Nor can I." Arthur leaned against the heavy mahogany desk. He swirled the remaining scotch in his glass, listening to the clink of the ice. "You made a very powerful enemy tonight." "Hastings is an idiot," she said flatly, stepping into the room. She walked toward the dying fire, holding her hands out toward the faint heat. "Idiots are only dangerous if you pretend they are smart." "I refuse to pretend." "You defended me." "I defended myself," she shot back, looking at him over her shoulder. The firelight caught the crooked angle of her nose, the sharp jut of her cheekbones. "Do not flatter yourself, Arthur. They were laughing at me just as much as they were laughing at you. I will not be the punchline to a joke written by a man who cannot even manage his own tailoring." Arthur set his glass down. The sharp clack of crystal against wood echoed in the quiet room. "Why are you here, Beatrice?" She turned to face him fully. She clutched the shawl tighter, her knuckles turning white. Because we have a contract. A legal, binding contract. The settlements are signed. Your brother's debts are paid. I sent the draft to the bank this morning. The settlements mean nothing if the marriage is annulled, she stated, her voice devoid of emotion, though her breathing was shallow and fast. An unconsummated marriage can be dissolved. If Hastings decides to challenge the wager, he will look for proof. If he finds out we sleep at opposite ends of the house... Arthur's stomach twisted. He stared at her, horrified by the cold transactional nature of her logic. You came down here to settle a ledger. I came down here to secure my future. I am not going to annul the marriage, Beatrice. You are a duke who married a spinster on a dare, she snapped, stepping away from the fire. Her calm facade was finally cracking, revealing the panicked, desperate woman underneath. You will wake up one morning. The novelty of my sharp tongue will have worn off, and you will realize you are chained to a woman you do not want. You will want an heir. You will want a beautiful wife who doesn't embarrass you, and you will find a way to discard me. I cannot go back to that house, Arthur. I cannot go back to the cold. She was shaking now, not from the chill of the room, but from a deeply rooted, bone-deep terror. Arthur closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He didn't think. He didn't calculate. He reached out and grabbed her by the shoulders. His large hands gripped the wool of her shawl, pulling her up short. Stop, he ordered, his voice ragged. Beatrice flinched, turning her face away, expecting anger, expecting cruelty. Arthur didn't yell. He dropped his forehead against hers. He felt her gasp, a sharp intake of air against his mouth. She smelled of lavender soap and the cold night air. I am an arrogant, selfish bastard, Arthur whispered, his breath mingling with hers. I bought you. I used you to win a ridiculous, drunken game. But I am not going to discard you. You don't want me, she whispered back to the floor, refusing to meet his eyes. Her voice broke on the words. You couldn't even bear to touch me last night. The pain in her voice gutted him. He slid his hands up her arms, pushing the heavy wool shawl off her shoulders. It dropped to the rug with a soft thud. His hands moved to her jaw, his thumbs tracing the sharp, tense lines of her face. He forced her to look at him. I didn't touch you last night because I was ashamed, Arthur said, the truth tasting like ash in his mouth. Because I looked at you and realized I had bought something I had no right to own. I didn't touch you because you looked at me like I was a monster. And you were right. Beatrice stared up at him, her dark eyes wide, searching his face for the mockery, the trap. She found nothing but raw, bleeding honesty. She let out a shaky breath. You are not a monster. You are just a man with too much money and not enough sense. A fractured, breathless laugh scraped out of Arthur's throat. There is the Gorgon. I am serious, Arthur. So am E. He didn't give her time to retreat. He leaned down and pressed his mouth to hers. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't a rehearsed, elegant kiss. It was desperate, a collision of teeth and heat. He tasted the faint salt of tears she refused to shed. He gripped her waist, pulling her flush against him, feeling the frantic, hammering rhythm of her heart against his chest. For a second, she stood entirely rigid, frozen in shock. Then, with a sudden, choked sound, her hands flew up. She didn't push him away. She grabbed fistfuls of his linen shirt, pulling him harder against her. She kissed him back with an aggressive, starving ferocity. All the anger, all the humiliation, all the cold, lonely years poured into the desperate friction of their mouths. Arthur backed her into the heavy mahogany desk. Books spilled onto the floor, the heavy thuds masked by the harsh sound of their breathing. He tangled his fingers in her thick, copper-streaked hair, pulling her head back to kiss her throat. It was messy, it was imperfect, it was exactly what they both needed. Dawn cast harsh gray angles across the scattered books. Arthur woke with a vicious cramp in his back and the lingering taste of scotch. He lay on the Persian rug. The heavy velvet curtains remained open, revealing a sleet-washed London morning. He couldn't move. Beatrice slept, her head resting heavily against his chest. Her dark hair formed a tangled net across his collarbone. One hand gripped the linen of his crumpled shirt, holding on even in unconsciousness. The room smelled of cold ash and fading lavender. Arthur stared at the ceiling, feeling her steady breath against his neck. The cynical armor he had worn for a decade felt violently obsolete. He expected an anchor to drag him down. Instead, he found a crowbar prying open the rusted cage of his life. He shifted carefully. Beatrice stirred, a soft, raspy groan catching in her throat. Blinking open her eyes, she was disoriented for a fraction of a second before memory slammed into her. She pushed up instantly, spine snapping rigid. She pulled the edges of her chemise together, flushing a deep, defensive red. "Do not," Arthur said, his voice thick with sleep. He caught her wrist before she could scramble up. "Do not put the walls back up. Not this morning." Beatrice looked down, her chest rising rapidly. She looked terrified, raw, and completely beautiful. "The servants will be awake. Linfield will find us." "Let him," Arthur replied, sitting up to rub his stiff neck. "It is my house. You are my wife. Linfield can fetch coffee." 2 hours later, they sat in the breakfast room. The atmosphere wasn't the freezing vacuum of yesterday, nor was it a fairy tale. It was a tentative truce. Beatrice wore a dark green gown that actually fit her shoulders. She was meticulously buttering a scone when Linfield entered with a silver tray of morning papers. The top paper, the London Gazette, featured a hastily sketched caricature of Arthur holding a bag of money while a woman with Medusa hair chased a terrified Lord Hastings. Arthur stared at the ink. His stomach hardened into a cold knot. Beatrice plucked the paper from the tray, examining the drawing with the calculating eye of an art critic assessing a forgery. "They gave me an aggressive chin," she noted, her voice perfectly even, "and Hastings appears to be crying. How accurate." "I am going to White's," Arthur said, pushing his chair back. The leg scraped harshly. "I will end this today." She pinned him with a dark look. "You cannot punch him, Arthur. If you assault him, you validate his mockery. You prove we are the desperate creatures he claims." "I am not going to punch him," Arthur said, his knuckles white. "I am going to pay him." White's Gentlemen's Club smelled of expensive cigars, damp wool, and generational arrogance. As Arthur strode into the betting room, the low hum of conversation died. Dozens of eyes snapped to him. The only sound was the crackle of the hearth. Hastings slouched in a wingback chair, nursing port. He looked up, a sneer stretching across his pale face. "Westford," Hastings drawled. "Come to seek refuge? Or did the Gorgon throw you out?" Arthur walked directly to the small table in front of Hastings. Reaching into his greatcoat, he withdrew a heavy velvet pouch and dropped it onto the mahogany surface. It hit the wood with a massive, heavy clack, the sound of raw gold. Whispers erupted like a lit fuse. Hastings stared at the bag, his sneer faltering. "You lost? You're annulling the marriage?" "No." Arthur planted his hands on the table, leaning down until he was mere inches from Hastings. He smelled sour wine on the man's breath. "I remain entirely married, but I am paying the debt because the premise of the wager was flawed." Hastings recoiled into the leather. "Flawed? You bet you could survive the punishment of the Hale spinster." "She is not a punishment," Arthur stated with chilling, absolute certainty. "She is the only intelligent woman in this god-forsaken city. She possesses more spine, more wit, and more worth than any man in this room, including you, including me." Arthur straightened, meeting the shocked stares of his peers. "I bought a wife on a drunken dare. It is the most shameful thing I've ever done, but I will not insult her by pretending she is a burden. I forfeit the money, Hastings, because I won." Turning his back on the sputtering lord, he walked out into the freezing air. His chest felt lighter than it had in years. The persistent ache behind his eyes was gone. Returning to the townhouse, Arthur bypassed his study and walked straight upstairs. He found Beatrice in the East Wing sitting room. She sat at a small desk, household ledgers open. Her fingers were already ink-stained. She paused as he entered. The tension in her jaw was visible, a lingering fear that he had ruined the fragile ground they stood on. Arthur pulled up a wooden chair, sitting directly across from her. He looked at the stark columns of numbers, the precise slant of her handwriting. Then he looked at her crooked nose and dark, wary eyes. "The ledger is settled," Arthur said quietly. Beatrice studied his face, reading the raw honesty etched there. Slowly, her rigid shoulders softened. Setting her pen down, the nib clicked softly against the inkwell. She reached across the open book, extending her hand. Arthur took it. Her skin was warm, blunt nails tracing his knuckles. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was messy, practical, and entirely real. "Good," Beatrice murmured, a faint, genuine smile finally cracking her armor. "Now, help me fix these accounts. Your steward is an idiot." Did Beatrice's sharp tongue and Arthur's harsh reality pull you in? Real love isn't found in flowery poetry. It's forged in cold rooms, quiet defiance, and messy truths. If you enjoyed this raw, grounded, historical drama, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Beatrice's shoes? Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell for more unapologetic romance and immersive storytelling. Support us to keep the fire burning.